Joining me now in the studio to talk about agriculture and rural economic issues is the chair of the Agriculture, Rural Development and Housing Policy Committee, Senator Bill Weber. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Last session, you authored a bill that would bring shrimp aquaculture to the state and also to your district. What is the status of that?
Well, actually, earlier this week on Monday, I attended a groundbreaking in Ballatin, Minnesota for True Shrimp. There they had the groundbreaking for their new research harbor, Ballatin Bay Reef, and it'll be their research harbor plus the harbor which they train employees. And it's a much scaled down version of what the final harbors will look like when they are built. But it's an important first step in the process. They are also working to put the production facilities together in Marshall, and I think, quite frankly, we're underway. The groundbreaking for the first full-scale harbor should happen next spring.
And so how long before we get to buy Minnesota-grown shrimp?
Well, actually, as I look at that, the harbor, it's 9 acres under roof. However, they have it designed to a point where they can get a reef done and start producing while they go on to the next and the next. And so I don't have a specific timeline as to when that will be possible, but I think that I would think that sometime close to a year from now, I think we should be starting to have some possibilities of that happening.
Not long ago in the Worthington Daily Globe, you wrote about the passage of the 1-year moratorium on ditch mowing that happened in the last session. You said that it is, quote, lending a voice to farmers and landowners who have been adversely affected by the rule. In the really unscientific Senate State Fair poll, there was a question about ditch mowing, and 60% of those who responded were concerned about protecting habitat for pollinators and nesting birds. So what is the right policy going forward for this ditch mowing issue?
Well, I think that as you look at the ditch mowing issue, let's go back first when you talk about the time structure in that whole scenario. When you need to wait till August 1st, you've pretty much wasted the ability to utilize that as good hay. You just get too far, your plants get too fully developed, and the nutrient value of that plant goes down, and therefore those that are relying on that for hay, it becomes less of a benefit to them. Also, I look at this and say, okay, as we talk about pollinator habitat, and I understand that. I've got tons of butterflies out in my garden right now. But the reality of it is, do you want butterflies coming to habitat crossing lanes of traffic that are traveling 55 to 65 miles an hour? Also, do you want for the breeding habitat for birds, do you want your pheasants gliding through the traffic pattern? So to me, it's not necessarily the most realistic and necessarily the best opportunity for those two factors in the first place. And I think many of the other rules that were being promulgated by the state at that point were also, I think, you had to do it this way, you had to have this, you had to have that. And I think we've been traveling those ditches and operating and mowing those ditches for years. I think there's just a general resentment that the state now can come in and tell us that we need to do it differently, or they think they know how to do it better. And so I think that right now we need to make sure that if you're going to develop rules for that you have people at the table that actually know what's going on out there. I think you also have to have people at the table, and I think the state office in St. Paul needs to listen to their district people, because if you talk to their district people, if the farming community says, fine, take care of your own road ditches, they don't have the equipment and the manpower to actually do it. So, the state has not been necessarily without their share of benefit in the farmers going out and doing this. And so hopefully in the final discussion we'll be able to reach some timelines that are realistic, that meet the needs of both parties, and actually at least they're approaching in a way that quite frankly, they should have done in the first place.
Well, let's turn to Palmer amaranth, which is a very noxious and invasive weed. There was some stuff passed in the last legislative session to address this and other invasive species that are affecting Minnesota's agricultural economy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, certainly. One of our chief concerns is that the areas in which Palmer amaranth has shown up in Minnesota has been in those areas that have conservation plantings. And, they said, well, the seed, that was sort of an isolated instance, how that seed got in there, but the reality of it is that the Palmer amaranth seed, which is an extremely fine seed, it is a challenge to keep it out of seed. And actually, you can go to the seed catalogs as a gardener and not find Palmer amaranth, but you can find different types of amaranth that are out there for the flower garden. So, I mean, it is a real challenge. And every time that we actually seed an area of ground for the conservation plantings, we run that risk. Actually, with the buffer strip legislation and all that type of thing, the increased demand, which quite frankly we can't meet on a local basis, it actually gives rise to a greater risk for Palmer amaranth to be brought in.
So you're concerned that certain invasives are going to be brought in by the plantings that will be put in these buffer strips. And so it could actually make the problem worse?
It could. It could. Now, we kept being told by the department, during session, well, that this is a minor problem and what have you, but you know what happens to minor problems, particularly when you have plants that produce thousands of seeds and then all of a sudden get distributed if they're left to go unchecked. And so it is a concern. It still is a concern, even with those actions that we took in the session.
And can you just go quickly through some of those actions that were taken during session?
Well, we actually made sure that there was money there for continued research in how to control it, because that's been part of the problem. It is an extremely difficult plant to control, except for fire and going out and literally burning these plants. And then also we did have provision that we wanted to have only Minnesota grown seed. That did not make it into the final bill, but that was the main thing that actually happened during session.
Commodity prices right now are pretty low, and when you consider that the average age of farmers in Minnesota is 50, what is your advice for people looking to get into farming since it's so cost prohibitive?
Well, the challenge has been there for quite some time as far as getting our young people into the farming business. The cost of land, the cost of rent, the cost of equipment have all been extremely high for quite a while. Now you couple that with the poor commodity prices that you referred to, and it becomes very difficult even for existing farmers to remain in the business. The fortunate thing that we're at a point right now, for those of us that remember the 1980s and the difficulties that we had in the farm economy at that time, we're at a different point in terms of most of our farmers are not, from a debt standpoint, in as serious of a situation as they were back then. And certainly we've seen lower interest rates, which has also made a substantial difference. But when you stop and think about that, this year in many areas of the state, we are looking at a reduced crop yield because we had really wet early and then we had really dry in the middle, and so we have acres that this year are not producing very good crop that had excellent crops last year. The compounding of a lower yield for many people plus the lower price is really going to be difficult. As far as our young people, we did try to take some action this year in the tax bill and providing benefits to people who sell to whether it's equipment, whether it's land, and there are different formulas depending upon which assets you're talking about, to young farmers in order to help them get started. But the reality of it remains that unless you have a specific farmer, be it a relative, be it a neighbor, just be it a friend of the family who knows that you want to get started, it remains a very difficult venture for our young people to get started. And usually at some point they need to have the security of an established farmer working with them in order to help them get into the business.
Almost an apprenticeship.
Well, in many respects, yes. In many respects, yes. And a lot of times they can manage to work out trading of physical labor for equipment use, you know, and that type of thing. But it is right now with cash rents in my area being, for example, running anywhere from, well, it's a broad range, but there's rents well over $300 an acre to, you know, well over $200 an acre. And when you have corn at less than $3 a bushel and all the price of the inputs that go into that, it doesn't work out.
Yeah, it's a challenging proposition.
That's right.
Senator Weber, it's always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.